The 1920s and 30s were a hotbed of spiritual scams and religious cults, so much so that many of them have just been somewhat forgotten by history. It was a time of economic depression, with the looming threat of a world war, and people were desperate for a way to prosper and thrive in a deeply uncertain world. Coming off the back of the new thought and theosophy movements, a new wave of spiritual teachers took the United States by storm. There were people like our friends Guy and Edna Ballard, who drew huge crowds across the country, or May Otis Blackburn, who admittedly didn't draw the same number of people, but she still got a few. And then there was James B. Schafer, a man most people have never heard of, despite his close association with one of the most well-known self-help con artists of all time, Napoleon Hill. If it wasn't for Schafer's strange fixation with rearing an immortal child, we might not have heard about him at all. And I promise that very soon on this channel, we will be leaving the 1930s and entering more modern times. Just not right now, because we're going straight into the strange world of James Schafer, Baby Jean, and the Royal Fraternity of Master Metaphysicians. But before we do, I would like to thank today's sponsor. Yes, we've got a sponsor for today's video. Can you believe it? And it's HelloFresh. Now, I don't know about you, but sometimes cooking can feel like the absolute bane of my existence. I've got like 3 meals that I can cook really well. And when I'm busy, I will just eat the same thing for like 4 days because I don't have the time or the patience to learn something new. And that's where HelloFresh comes to the rescue and saves me from a world of banality and the same tuna pasta dish over and over and over and over again until I die. At HelloFresh, you can choose from over 55 weekly options with pre-portioned, high-quality ingredients delivered straight to your door. And because everything is pre-portioned, that means you're cutting down on food waste. And let's be honest, how often have you bought a bag of spinach, used a handful in a recipe, and let the rest of the bag deteriorate at the bottom of your fridge? I know that I have many, many times. Also, the fact that everything is pre-portioned means that you don't have to spend time weighing and measuring ingredients. It's all just ready to go. And all you need to do is follow the foolproof step-by-step recipes that make for an incredibly stress-free and joyful cooking experience. Look how joyful I am. Look at how much I'm enjoying this quesadilla. It was absolutely delicious. So what are you waiting for? Go to hellofresh.com and use code EmilyLouise16 for up to 16 free meals and free surprise gifts. So thank you to HelloFresh for sponsoring today's video, and without further ado, let's get into it.
It's all in your mind. It's all in your mind. You'll get over it.
Like a lot of these scam artists from the early 1900s, James Schafer's early years are a bit of a mystery. He's believed to have been born in around 1896 in Fargo, North Dakota, and according to a 1940 article, he claimed to have a doctor's degree from the University of Michigan. But that's from his own mouth, and we'll come to see that he's not exactly a reliable source. He was also a former member of the KKK, because of course he was. He was heavily inspired by the New Thought movement, which is a loose belief system that originated in the United States in the mid-1800s, although you can trace its evolution back a lot further. The founder is widely regarded to be a man named Phineas Quimby. According to him, he was a mesmerist, which meant that he practiced animal magnetism. And you might be thinking, isn't that the 1980 album by Scorpions? And you are right, but sadly this isn't a video on 80s metal bangers. I bloody wish it was. Animal magnetism was a theory created by Anton Mesmer, hence why practitioners call themselves mesmerizers. The theory of animal magnetism claimed that there's an invisible force that a mesmerizer can command at will to heal people from sickness. Now, Anton Mesmer believed that this was a kind of magnetic fluid that could be controlled, but Phineas Quimby wasn't satisfied with that theory, and he began to develop his own, eventually claiming that the trouble is in the mind, for the body is only the house for the mind to dwell in. If your mind has been deceived by some invisible enemy into a belief, you have put it into the form of a disease, with or without your knowledge. Quimby's entire theory, or his truth as he called it, was based on the idea that disease is the misery of our belief. and that man's happiness or misery depends on himself. According to John S. Haller, New Thought struck a path that placed full responsibility for an individual's plight into this social, political, and economical world on the individual and the rightness of his or her thinking. Untouched by irony, New Thoughters remained conscious of society's evils, but considered them unimportant in the greater scheme of things. Mary Baker Eddy was a patient and then a student of Quimby's, and she attached religious significance to his theories, later going on to found Christian Science. Quimby's theories had a remarkable influence in the 19th century, overlapping with other spiritual movements of the time, such as Theosophy. They weren't exactly the same, but they shared a lot of commonalities. In the early 20th century, New Thought writers churned out self-help books and correspondence courses like a well-oiled machine, capitalizing on the public's appetite for get-rich-quick schemes and the promise that anyone could be successful. And it's an appealing lie that your material conditions don't matter. It's just the things that you decide to think. Writers like Wallace Wattles, James Allen, and Charles Hennell wrote about the science of getting rich, the foundation stones to happiness and success, and the law of attraction, both directly inspiring more modern works like The Secret by Rhonda Byrne. One of the most popular writers of this vein in the early 20th century was Napoleon Hill, author of the self-help book favoured by Alpha Sigma grindset bros across the world, Think and Grow Rich. See, Napoleon Hill was a 1930s Gary Vee.
I just don't get the mentality of being head down sad on a Monday morning.
He was a 20th century Molly May.
You're given one life and it's down to you what you do with it. Like, you can literally go in any direction. And when I've spoken about that before in the past, I have been slammed a little bit with people saying, you know, like, it's easy for you to say that, you know, you've grown up and you've not grown up in poverty, you've not grown up, you know, with major money struggles. So for you to sit there and say that we all have the same 24 hours in a day is not correct. And I'm like, but technically what I'm saying is correct. We do.
Individualism was sewn into the fabric of this belief system, and many people fell for it and continue to fall for it to this day. The book was written during the Great Depression, where people were living on the breadline and desperate for a way to make money. It was published in 1937 and became a huge hit with people who bought into the idea that all they needed to do was think better and suddenly they'd have enough money to support themselves. There's been much written on the legacy of Napoleon Hill and whether or not he was a scam artist and a liar, fabricating his supposed meeting with Andrew Carnegie and other famous rich people. Anyway, I'm banging on about him because back in April 1939, he and his wife hit the headlines when they claimed to have come up with a plan to rear the perfect family. They were going to choose 15 children from across the country and raise them in what they called the perfect environment. Now, this was happening in a time where the infant mortality rate was around 1 in 15, an improvement on earlier decades where infant mortality was around 1 in 7 children, but still super high. It was also taking place against the backdrop of the practice of eugenics in the United States. See, years earlier it was commonplace to see better baby contests at your local state fair, where infants would be judged on their appearance, mental and psychological fitness, and whether or not they were impaired. Eugenics was designed to stop those deemed as unfit from having children, and the brutal practice of forced sterilisation was weaponised against the most marginalised communities in the United States, with black and indigenous women being far more likely than white women to be victim to eugenics policies. Alongside this, eugenics targeted disabled people and those deemed lower class. Brooke Carlaw writes that it is important to recognise that in American history, eugenics was a movement that worked to reduce the undesired population to push racist, classist, ableist and sexist ideals rather than a movement that explicitly worked toward the improvement of the human race. And while I think there's a discernible difference between Napoleon Hill's so-called experiment and the practice of eugenics, they do share some similarities. Both of them are rooted in social Darwinism, the idea that only the strongest survive, that the people who are successful are in that position because they're the most deserving. The New Thought movement promoted the idea that any anyone can be successful, that it's about training the mind versus your material conditions. As John Haller said, the New Thought movement deemed society's ills unimportant, and people like Napoleon Hill and James Schafer never bothered themselves with worrying about things like Jim Crow laws or forced sterilisation. While Napoleon Hill wasn't so much concerned with genetics, he did have a strict requirement list for the prospective child. To be considered for the experiment, the child had to be at least 5 years old, but no older than 9, be of sound body and mind, have no parents, or have parents that are unable to provide for the child, but not be confined to an orphanage, because according to Napoleon, children confined in an orphanage have a danger of rooting an inferiority complex that would be difficult to remove. Now, I know what you're thinking. This all sounds very sus, right? Random man advertising for children saying he's going to rear them in a perfect environment. Personally, I would have run for the fucking hills. But apparently, they already had 2 children living with them. According to Napoleon and his wife, they had reached marital harmony. And Napoleon said,
"Well, Mrs. Hill and I have affected this rhythmic harmony between ourselves. Our plan is to teach these youngsters to lead and not be led, to use and not be used. No sooner do either of us start forming a habit than it is immediately broken. As example, Mrs. Hill smokes cigarettes, but she stops for weeks at a time to prove to herself that she is using the cigarette and it is not using her. We intend to promote moderation in all things and excess in none."
Alongside this, Napoleon spoke about one of the children already under their supervision. Her name, strangely enough, was also Jean, and she was the daughter of their housekeeper. They claimed that her mother didn't know how to raise Jean, and therefore they began to exert their influence on the child. Napoleon claimed that since their experiment with Jean began, she had lost 40 pounds through correct eating, had developed poise, and no longer bit her fingernails. The way they depict Jane reeks of classism. She's the daughter of the housekeeper, their employee, and instead of helping Jane's mother provide for her, they've decided to take control of Jane and set up their own makeshift eugenics experiment. Napoleon Hill even says,
"And this will in no sense be a home for backward children or delinquents of any sort, nor will we consider a child in whose parents there is a strain of insanity."
Napoleon and his wife didn't end up adopting 15 children like they'd hoped, but their short-lived experiment had influence on James B. Schafer, who had moved from Michigan to New York with his wife and 2 children, and formed the Royal Fraternity of Master Metaphysicians. I feel like I keep saying that wrong, but I'm fairly certain that is how you say it. But if I have said it wrong, I know that somebody's going to correct me in the comments. There is always someone in the comments ready to point out your flaws.
It's a kind of magic. One shot of light that shows.
The timeline is sketchy as hell, but we know that Schafer's teachings had amassed a following of around 10,000 people by the late 1930s. But what was it all about? Well, like a lot of these groups, it was a bit of a hodgepodge, a cut and paste job. An article in the Brooklyn Eagle in 1938 describes the followers as elderly and middle-aged students of theosophy and metaphysics. There was definitely an overlap between theosophists and those that followed New Thought teachings, but it's important to stress that these were 2 very distinctive movements that happened to gain traction around the same time. An article in Time magazine in 1938 said it best.
What they study is far from clear, but the Royal Fraternity's creed might be described as a theological goulash of Rosicrucianism, Christian Science, Christianity, super mind science, faith feeling, and how to win friends and influence people.
The creed of the Royal Fraternity of Master Metaphysicians was, "Lord, I do give thee thanks for the abundance that is mine." See, the New Thought movement quickly became concerned with material gain, which isn't all that surprising when you look at the time in which these movements are gaining traction. It was the technological revolution, the rise of factory labour, and while Marx was busy critiquing capitalism, the New Thought movement was all about training your mind to thrive under it. People like Schafer, with his supposed medical degree, started lecturing at Carnegie Hall, as well as having a regular Sunday lecturing spot at the Ziegfeld Theatre. The Metaphysicians also had what they called a peace centre in Steinway Hall, and it's said that Schafer himself had offices there. It was here that they would hold thinker job clinics for unemployed people at the end of the Great Depression. And according to an article in the Standard Speaker, several men, identified as experts on social problems, led the discussion. They would basically tell unemployed people that all they needed to do to get a job was to harness the powerful cosmic currents that could bring about the personal well-being of the individual. It's all in the mind, baby. Anyone can make it in America. Schafer and his royal fraternity were keen readers, and they loved a bit of Napoleon Hill, with one journalist going so far as to claim that it was one of their sacred holy books. Schafer called himself the messenger, and he had a flair for publicity. Supposedly there's a newsreel somewhere of him promising that his followers will become millionaires in the next year. I was trying to find that newsreel for bloody ages. I was even emailing archival places being like, have you heard of this bloke, James Schafer? And I never got a response. I think it's been lost in the annals of time, which is disappointing because I, for one, would have loved to have seen it. He also made grandiose claims that he could dematerialise people or things that stood in his way. So he's got a bit of a men who stare at ghosts vibe going on. He also alluded to having a teacher that was way over 100 years old, but to look at him, you wouldn't think that he was more than 40. And although I haven't found anything that proves that Schafer claimed communication with ascended masters, I wouldn't be at all surprised if that was what he was alluding to. Schafer took the tenets of the New Thought movement, the idea of the mind as the maker, and went full balls to the wall with it. He was telling his followers that death and disease aren't actually real. It's just what society wants you to think. It's the evil hand of the man stopping you from reaching your true immortal potential.
You are not body. As an individual entity functioning as an individual sphere, which is true of each one of you, you are all-powerful mind. The body is the vehicle through which you function. You are the master. Your body is the servant. In reality, there is no death. What man calls death is but birth into the unseen. Whatever ills you suffer from now, you will have in the next phase of your existence. You will have them until you gain enough knowledge of truth to free yourself.
He was described in the press as being precise and well-tailored, a charismatic man by all accounts. The kind of charisma that could have followers parting with a hefty amount of cash. See, the Metaphysicians were encouraged to give love gifts to help with the mission. It's eerily identical to what Guy and Edna Ballard asked from their own followers. To become a truth student, a term coined by Schafer, you had to cough up $100 for a fellowship certificate, which is the equivalent of around $2,000 today. A hell of a lot of money for people that are just emerging from an economic depression. But don't worry, he did do payment plans. You could put $10 down up front and then pay the rest in instalments. It's like a cult version of Klarna. Schafer would provide the certificates alongside a check drawn from the inexhaustible bank of the infinite in the universal mind. And the checks were dated the eternal now, and they were payable in ideas and everything desired with no limitations. Alongside this, Schafer was enamoured with Lloyd C. Douglas's 1929 book Magnificent Obsession, where the protagonist, Robert Merrick, donates to charities anonymously. Schafer encouraged his followers to do the same, the idea being that good deeds done secretly could help you reap significant spiritual power. The love gifts that Schafer accrued were funneled into buying up property. They had their offices in Steinway Hall, but that wasn't enough. They needed a place to call their own, a spiritual retreat where truth students could come together, and it needed to be big because there were a lot of truth students. So, in January 1938, Schafer and his master metaphysicians got the love gifts together and purchased the 110-room former home of William Vanderbilt, commonly known as Idle Hour. Despite the estate being valued at $2.5 million, They claimed to have bought it for a mere $50,000, and it was alleged that none of the Vanderbilt heirs wanted the burden of looking after the place. They're like, we can't be bothered with this. We're rich. We don't want to be looking after this dusty ass house. Before Schafer and his true students had gotten a hold of it, it had been an artist colony run by a New York socialite called Lucy Thompson, but she had sold off the property sometime in the 1930s. Schafer had big dreams for the property. He wanted to remodel it to accommodate 250 students and fellows of the metaphysical order, saying that they would indulge in the study of life and the pursuit of truth with a capital T. But Idlehour wasn't in great shape. It hadn't exactly gone full Grey Gardens yet, but it needed a new lease of life. And a new name. The Metaphysicians rebranded it as Peace Haven, and Schafer himself said,
People of kindred spirit blend together in this house, which has been made possible by much hard work. It is your house and my house, and we will dedicate it on this 4th of July to the thought of liberty and peace and love for all mankind. We will dedicate Peace Haven as a gift to life. Let our message of peace and love and truth encircle the earth. Our dream has come true here.
But the dream of Peace Haven wasn't going to last for long. See, there were quite a few other properties on the Idlehour estate. Schafer had just bought the lavish Vanderbilt home, and the locals weren't exactly thrilled with their new neighbours. As a religious organisation, you couldn't expect the Royal Fraternity of Master Metaphysicians to pay such worldly dues such as taxes. Obviously not. They filed for tax exemption as a religious and charitable organisation, and that pissed off the locals, who said,
The Royal Fraternity of Master Metaphysicians is a cult, or organisation having for its purpose and its belief matters that are foreign and different from those provided for in the tax law for exemption of charitable and religious organisations.
Alongside the Vanderbilt home, the group also acquired Pepperidge Hall, which was a 60-room chateau also in the Idlehour neighbourhood. They purchased it for a bargain price of $15,000, which is about $313,000 in today's money. You'd be lucky to get a 2-bedroom house in the county where I live for that today, so honestly, they got a pretty good deal. Actually, forget about a house, you'd be lucky to get a flat for that. They claim to have bought the property because of a growth in international membership, and Schafer called it the Community of Nations. At some point, Schafer was also being paid $15 a day to visit the terminally ill daughter of a New York millionaire, and he kept visiting for 5 months. When she finally died and the parents realised that Schafer's thought healing hadn't helped, he decided to blame her death on her own lack of coordination, his words not mine. Because remember, only you are responsible for your life and your healing, even if you're bedbound and terminally ill. That's literally how far people like Schafer will go to blame you for your own misfortune. But despite all that, the love gifts are flowing. They've got enough money to buy up 2 huge estates, and according to Schafer, by September 1939, they had 40 million truth students in the United States alone. Now, I don't exactly buy that, because that would mean that over 30% of the US population in 1939 was a follower of James Schafer, and this lad isn't exactly well remembered. In fact, if it wasn't for his strange stunt in late November of that year, he might have been forgotten about entirely. On the 25th of November 1939, a strange story hit the pages of newspapers across the United States. It claimed that the Royal Fraternity of Master Metaphysicians had begun the process of adopting a 5-month-old baby named Jean. She was the daughter of Catherine Gaunt, who'd been working as a waitress and struggling to make ends meet. It's not known how she ended up meeting James Schafer. It's most likely that he was looking for a way to expand on Napoleon Hill's strange but short-lived experiment with children just a few months prior, targeting working-class mothers that were struggling to get by at the tail end of the Great Depression and the beginning of World War II. Schafer was clearly enamoured with Napoleon Hill, so much so that he named him Jean's godfather. But Schafer wasn't content with just rearing children to live rich and successful lives. He wanted them to live forever. See, Schafer believed that if a child was to never hear about death, disease, or poverty, and if they were raised on a diet of vegetarianism and positive thinking, they could beat the curse of mortality. He said that the experiment with baby Jean would prove once and for all that man is an immortal being and that Jean would achieve immortality. Although her diet in the early years was to be strictly monitored, when she grew up, he said that they wouldn't stop her from indulging in the material delights of the modern world, saying,
"Of course, Jean may go down to the corner when she grows up and she might buy a hot dog, but nobody will restrain her. We will just tell her why it isn't good for her. And she may smoke a cigarette, but she will soon find out that it makes her dizzy and sick and she will quit. And she may drink a highball someday, but she'll find out why it's bad for her. There will be no restraint on Jean, but our teachings will serve to guide her to immortality."
One of the things I love about this is that they acknowledge that Jean will begin to age, but they're like convinced that she won't die. So what I want to know is, at what point was the aging process supposed to stop? Like, does she get to her mid-20s and her body's like, I'm done, this is it, I'm forever young? Either way, she was growing older, and in January she marked her 6th month on this mortal coil. And in typical theatrical fashion, a ceremony was held for her. She was presented with a ring that was supposedly valued at $50,000, and even Napoleon Hill and his wife showed up, allegedly giving her a scrapbook to record her expected endless days. I really do wonder how many people that read Think and Grow Rich would think twice about the contents if they knew about this story, that the supposedly brilliant Napoleon Hill was, by all accounts, a scamming grifter who believed in immortal babies. You couldn't make it up. Schafer's followers were desperate to be involved in the raising of baby Jean, and they went as far as to pay for access to her. A follower named Louise paid a whopping $7,000 just to be baby Jean's nurse. That's around $150,000 in today's money. Someone should have told her that she was the one that should have been getting paid, not Schafer. There aren't any accounts of Jean being mistreated as such, and I don't doubt that the followers looked after her, but it's important to remember that she's been ripped away from her mother to be raised as a kind of demigod for people who think that it's literally possible to cheat death. While it might not be outright overt child abuse, it's definitely disturbing, and it does get even more bizarre. See, within the Royal Fraternity of Master Metaphysicians, Schafer had a unique male-only organisation called the Storks. Schafer himself was the head stork, and then there was the vice chief stork, a stork stenographer, a stork financial secretary, a stork treasurer, just bloody storks everywhere. This group busied themselves with making layettes for expecting mothers. Now, layettes are sets of clothing and accessories for new babies, and they identified each other by wearing a safety pin on their lapel. Now, I've got no evidence that anything sus was going on, but I do think it's strange that there was an entire group of men making baby clothes as part of the larger operation. Now, this is just me hypothesizing, but were they using the layettes as a way to lure in potential mothers? Remember, this is all happening as the United States institutes the draft for World War II. There would have been a lot of mothers left to raise babies by themselves. What better circumstances if you want to rear a weird immortal baby army? It feels really predatory to me, especially considering the fact that we know that they targeted struggling working class mothers. Alongside this, Schafer sent a telegram to Winston Churchill in June of 1940, offering 500 British children refuge at Peacehaven. An article in the Evening Standard claimed that they were raising a fund to bring the children to the USA, and that it had initially started as a birthday collection for baby Jean, but obviously to receive, you must give. So they wanted to offer a safe place for British children. I'm not sure if they ever actually managed to bring children over. Most British children evacuated major towns and cities for more rural locations instead of flying halfway across the world. Depending on how you look at it, this was either a philanthropic gesture in the middle of war or a self-serving plan to raise their profile and flex their teachings on more innocent children. They were also still very much active in the property market, and in September of 1940, they signed a 3-year lease on the Adelphi Theatre. According to one of their spokespeople, the theatre was required
because of the need of an organization for the vast army of talent walking the streets seeking a haven of expression free of commercial taint and the blighting influence of greed.
Anyway, trouble was brewing in Peacehaven. Remember I told you that they filed for that tax exemption? Well, they weren't exactly successful. They got rejected, but that didn't stop them from appealing it, and it became a major dispute. Schafer and his followers believed themselves to be a charitable and religious organisation. Therefore, they shouldn't have to pay any taxes, right? Obviously, when an organisation files for tax exemption and fails, there's going to be a little bit of investigation. And like we've seen in other religious orders, like the Ballard's I Am activity, the taxman always knocks. And when he does, sometimes he ruins bloody everything.
Just a gigolo, and everywhere I go, people know the part I'm playing.
At the beginning of December 1940, Schafer and his followers said goodbye to baby Jean. She was just 1 year old at that point. The test in immortality was just getting started, so why did they give her back to her mother? According to Schafer, the parents had adjusted themselves and wanted their daughter back. He said that mother love is the greatest thing in the world. She wants her child, she shall have her. It could be that Jean's mother had concerns about how her baby was being raised, or that maybe she'd realised that Schafer had preyed upon her vulnerability and now she wanted her child back. Or it could have been that Schafer did have otherworldly abilities and perhaps peered into the future and saw his house of cards crumbling. Because just 3 days after it was reported that baby Jean was back with her mother, Attorney General John J. Bennett Jr. opened an investigation into the financial dealings of the Royal Fraternity of Master Metaphysicians. I'm telling you, it's a tale as old as time. They always get you with the tax stuff. You think you can get away with it and they come knocking at your door. And when people start sniffing around for something suspect, there's usually a bunch of people that are just waiting to throw you under the bus. And this case was no exception. People started contacting the Attorney General with all sorts of stories, from recently deceased followers handing over their entire estates to Schafer, to an elderly widow who alluded to Schafer stealing 2 expensive rings from her, later telling her that
Nothing is lost in the infinite, and you can think them back into your experience.
I'm telling you, that's the perfect get out of jail free card for absolutely anything. You just be like, no, I'm sorry, I didn't steal your ring or your money. And even if I did, all you got to do, sort your head out, babe. He'll be right back with you. One of the more disturbing allegations that came out was that James Schafer carried on much too lovingly with female members of the fraternity. Basically, he's a bloody dirty dog that can't keep his hands to himself. And apparently, when the followers would call him out on it, he said,
I can't deprive them of that. It's their aspirin.
It really just goes to show the cult of personality and the extreme narcissism of Schafer and others like him. They start off as relatively harmless gurus, claiming that they can help you improve your life, and they ultimately end up taking advantage of the people around them. The investigation also uncovered that Schafer had 13 different organisations with some pretty funky names. There was Think What You Want Inc. and Secret Givers Inc., the Centre of Peace and the Master Circle, to name just a few. He's got his fingers in many different pies, and in January 1941, Supreme Court Justice Philip J. McCook signed an injunction against him, preventing him from selling his fellowship certificates. Then, just 4 days later, a different Supreme Court Justice, Charles C. Lockwood, granted a motion to dismiss Schafer's application for tax-free status, saying that
it is difficult for one not versed in metaphysics to determine from Mr. Schafer's testimony the exact purpose, manner of operation, and financial methods of the organisation. However, visibility on this horizon seems to be clearing. The child destined to live forever has been returned to her natural mother, and the Attorney General of the state and the District Attorney of New York County are investigating the operation of the various corporations used by the Peacehaven Group to conduct their transactions.
You would have thought that all of this controversy would put off potential followers and that no parent in their right mind would hand over another baby to Schafer. But you'd be wrong. That same month, it was reported that a mother from California, a member of the fraternity, wanted to give her baby over to Schafer and the group at Peacehaven so it could receive the beautiful care that was given to baby Jean. The followers also claimed that the injunction obtained against them had been the biggest blessing, and that all the newfound press had led to hundreds of people wanting to join the organisation. I guess it's true what they say, no such thing as bad publicity. publicity. For some, they saw the investigation as the evil hand of the government clamping down on a harmless religious organisation. It didn't really matter to them that Schafer was scamming his followers out of large amounts of cash or being wildly inappropriate with women. How dare the government tread on a man's God-given right to scam and be a creep? Schafer called the men and women that had turned against him squealers, saying that they were just jealous because they weren't getting as much attention as the rest of his followers. In turn, they called him a spiritual gigolo who specialised in making dulcet promises to life-starved women. That is such a perfect insult. I love it. The best this man can come up with is squealers, and they have rid him for filth, decimated him. He did hit back though, and he said that all of his troubles came from the frustrated gutter consciousness, basically explaining that he had rescued people from the gutter only for them to try and destroy him. I just love that these are the people that make their living talking about personal responsibility and taking control of your thoughts, and when it comes to, taking responsibility for their actions, suddenly it's everyone else that's the bad guy. And by all accounts, Schafer was just going on with life normally, staging a performance of J.B. Priestley's play I Have Been Here Before at the Adelphi Theatre. He wasn't content with just putting the play on. He also sent telegrams to drama critics from all of the major New York newspapers, telling them that they must come along, obviously desperate for some good reviews. He also made an appearance at the Congress of the International New Thought Alliance, which was being held in the Hermitage Hotel in Nashville, Tennessee in the summer of 1941. But by the end of June, the money seemed to be drying up, and the vast estate that they had renamed Peacehaven was foreclosed on and put up for auction. But Schafer wasn't going to succumb to this gutter consciousness that wanted to drag him down, and he was literally just like, well, got to get on with the show. And he busied himself with putting on plays at the Adelphi Theatre that they ended up renaming the Radiant Centre. Even that caused controversy because he didn't hire union crews to work there, so the unions picketed outside almost every performance. And things went from pretty bad to an absolute nightmare when Schafer was arrested, accused of stealing $9,000 from a follower named Minna Schmidt. That's $178,000 in today's money. Definitely not chump change. Now, obviously, Schafer doesn't admit to a damn thing. He's got good vibrations on his side and he professes his innocence. But apparently he did threaten to dematerialise the follower when she told him that she was going to report him. His thoughts were clearly in impeccable order because he was freed the next day on a $5,000 bail. And he stayed a free man until the 25th of March 1942, where he stood in court faced with 9 charges of larceny. Now, Schafer already had a magazine named Truth Digest. He was in the magazine game, kind of like the Ballards were with The Voice of I Am. If you publish a little bit every month, you've basically got a guaranteed income stream. But Schafer wasn't going to settle for just one magazine. And luckily, his good friend Napoleon Hill came along with a money-making scheme. Schafer himself said,
Napoleon Hill came to me on or about the first day of December 1939, and he told me that he had an opportunity to purchase a magazine called Psychology for about $5,000. And that we each could put up $2,500 and we could become partners. He told me that although the magazine was then in very bad condition, it had once made $25,000 a year, and he thought that it could be built up again. I was interested, but I told him that I hadn't the money. I decided, however, to try and borrow $2,500 to go into the venture, and with that in view, I approached Minna Schmidt for the loan. I clearly stated to her the purpose for which I wanted the money, what I had been told by Mr. Hill concerning the history of the magazine, and what he thought of the future prospects, notwithstanding its poor financial condition at the time.
So Schafer and Hill were trying to make some quick cash. It was supposed to be an investment, but obviously the $25,000 never manifested, and instead he just gave Minna some fellowship certificates. Pleading guilty to that one charge left him liable for a prison sentence of 5 to 10 years. But while the court was figuring out the sentencing, another strange thing happened. A young man named Lionel Simon had read about Schafer's misfortune in the newspaper. He was only 19 and he worked as a clerk at a music shop. But when he heard about Schafer, He saw a golden opportunity. He decided to contact Schafer and threatened to expose him, basically called him up and blackmailed him, said that he knew that the newspaper was going to print a story about his misconduct with women followers and he wanted $200 to keep the story out of print. But Schafer cottoned on to the fact that he was being swindled and he met Lionel, gave him the money, and then the police swooped in and arrested him. That little side note has no bearing on the rest of the tale, but I thought it was too interesting to exclude. Anyway, so we get to May 1942 and Schafer was sentenced to 2.5 to 5 years in Sing Sing prison, whose notable inmates include Albert Fish and several members of Murder Inc. It was a maximum security jail, so it's no wonder that Schafer wept as he was being sentenced. The judge labelled him
a thief, an ex-Klansman who swindled his own organisation, a spiritual fake, and a religious hypocrite who has been loose, preying on misguided women for too long.
If you've watched my video on Guy and Ed the Ballard, you'll know that the early 1940s was when their legal troubles were taking centre stage. And it's interesting to me that in 1942, the same year as Edna and her son Donald were found guilty of mail fraud, Schafer is sent to jail. So many of these positive thought pyramid scheme cults were born in the 20s and 30s, in a time of great economic hardship. And the 40s seemed to be the moment of backlash. Things had gotten too out of control and some of these groups needed to be stopped. But where there's a will, there's always a way. And Schafer wasn't going to let a pesky thing like a prison sentence stop him from spreading his gospel of truth.
Let me down easy. Let me down easy.
Schafer was finally released from Sing Sing in 1945, but he didn't come out a changed man. He decided to enter the burgeoning correspondence school business, creating the American School of Metaphysics, and he ran it from an $80,000 estate in West Nyack, New York, but it was incorporated in Boulder City, Nevada. Correspondence courses had become incredibly popular, most notably used by Frank Bruce Robinson and his group Psychiana. He was even known as the mail order prophet. Schafer offered his potential students 7 courses in metaphysics, positive thinking, and all the usual stuff. And these courses would contain individual lessons that were priced at upwards of $2. If you wanted to buy all of the lessons in all of the courses, it sent you back a total of $350. Again, that's upwards of $5,000 today. And after you'd done all of these courses, you could then move on to the graduate class. It's a very much giving L. Ron Hubbard and the Bridge to Total Freedom. Just when you think you're out, they drag you back in with more courses and classes. By all accounts, these correspondence courses were quite fruitful for Schafer. He apparently had quite a lavish estate in West Nyack with expensive modern furnishings and a large stock of metaphysical equipment. He managed to stay out of the spotlight as well, and as far as I know, he didn't do anything all that controversial, just sold enlightenment and ideas of immortality and obscurity. I don't know what led him and his wife Cecilia to take their own lives on the 26th of April 1955, but that's what happened. They were found in their 1954 Lincoln hardtop convertible. They'd attached a vacuum cleaner hose to the exhaust and run it through the window, taping up any gaps. Their cause of death was carbon monoxide poisoning, and Schafer died with his arm around his wife. There was no obvious reason for why they had done it, and even their daughter said that she knew of no reason why her parents would end their own lives. They left her a note with instructions on how to keep the correspondence course business running, and allegedly wrote that there was no other way out. James was 59 and his wife Cecilia was 55. Now, I don't have any love lost for Schafer or people like him, but it is a tragic ending, and I'm not going to speculate on why they decided to do it. I think that would be a little bit macabre. Schafer has been largely forgotten about. There's a very limited Wikipedia article on him, and finding the books that he wrote is near on impossible. And after his death in 1955, there was very little written about him. Whenever he was written about, it was always in relation to the baby Jean experiment. And in 1965, journalists tried to get in contact with Jean, who was allegedly living nearby to the Idlauer estate with her husband. She wanted absolutely nothing to do with the story, and her husband rejected an interview outright. Some say that she is still alive, but I don't think we'll ever know. And I don't think it's our business either. She was a baby with no control over the situation, suddenly thrust into this strange world where she's being raised by a very culty organisation. I don't blame her for not wanting to talk about it. You don't have to look very far to find elements of Schafer's belief system in our modern lives. The concept of manifestation is everywhere, especially marketed to young women via manifestation journals, girl bossism, and pretty much any book with a rich, skinny white woman on the cover published by Hay House. Of course, all of this stems from the wider New Thought movement versus Schafer himself, but it's important to realise how prevalent these ideas are. More modern New Thought grifters like Joe Dispenza claim that you can heal yourself and build your dream life with nothing more than access to the quantum field and a positive mindset. They claim that you are responsible for building your reality, and I think that it's incredibly convenient for these people to sell you that lie, because let's face it, you're more likely to pick up a book that promises the secret to success than a book that explains that the system is rigged against you by the capitalist class. It gives you the chance to strip the world of all of its complicated nuance and see things in black and white. You're poor because you're just not as positive and dedicated to the grind as the rich people you aspire to be. It's definitely not because most of them had a running head start. What are you talking about?
And I want to stress here that this way of thinking completely ignores things like structural racism, the systematic oppression of one group of people. Don't forget that James Schafer himself was an admitted member of the KKK, so while he's telling all of his followers that all they need to do to be successful is just be positive and give him lots of money, he was also actively involved in a hateful terrorist organisation that made it their mission to uphold white supremacy.
Finally, I want to reiterate that there is nothing wrong with positive thinking, and I do think that it can have a profoundly positive impact on your life. My only issue is with snake oil salesmen like James Schafer that get rich off of the back of the working class by selling them a pack of lies. They feed off of the desire for a better life, telling you that if you just buy a fellowship certificate or a book or subscribe to my magazine or come to my masterclass or go on this retreat, that you can have that life that you've always wanted. And they'll always offer to show you the way to the riches of your wildest imagination, the life of your dreams. But if you get lost and find yourself broke because you've given them all your money, well, that's just your own fault. Thank you so much for watching the video. I'm really sorry. It always takes me forever. And, I'm just going to stop saying it at the end of every video. Yeah, maybe I'll be more regular in the future. Maybe I'll upload more regularly. Maybe I will. Maybe I won't. Maybe I'll just keep you surprised. Who knows? Maybe if you manifest it hard enough that I might just miraculously appear. Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed it and I will see you in the next one. Bye.